Fall of 2021, my family and I had just packed our house. And we loaded up a moving truck and sent it ahead. And we decided we want to take one last day, one last night in our home. And we slept on air mattresses on the floor. And we woke up the next morning, we packed those air mattresses up. And we packed the last pieces into my parents' RV and into our truck. And we got ready to leave. And I decided I needed one last look. And I walked up the stairways to the house, and I opened the front door. And I came face to face with our fireplace. What an odd thing to get emotional about, right? It's just a fireplace. But it was the fireplace that my kids were standing at when we told them we were buying our dream home. It was the fireplace they were standing at when we told them they'd never have to leave. They could be there forever. It's the fireplace they were standing at where all the hopes that I'd had in life had all come true. And it was the fireplace that I was standing at, staring at, saying goodbye. Saying goodbye because I knew that God had something bigger for me. I knew I had prayed, and I knew He'd given me just this comfort that I'm supposed to be here in Milwaukee, but it was hard to leave. What do you do in those moments? The moments where you know what you're supposed to do, and it seems right, and it seems comfortable, but the moment you have to act, everything falls apart. So I'll tell you what I did. Normally very stoic. You can't tell it right now probably, but I'm normally very stoic. And I fell to my knees. I cried. And I pleaded. They said, "Is there something else? Do I have to do this?" And I did. And I remember as I walked down the pathway to the truck to leave, seeing our neighbors who decided to sit outside and say goodbye to us, and waving to them as I drove away with this deep sense of emptiness. What do you do? What do you do when everything you've put hope in, everything that you believed in, starts to weigh you down? When it starts to overwhelm you and you don't know if you have the power to go on. See, in today's passage, this is the same place that Jesus is in. Broken, beat up, and torn. Knows what he has to do. Knows what he's called to do. But he also knows how hard it's about to be. If you recall, before we entered the Advent season, we were walking through the book of John. And we just finished John 17. And so today we're going to re-immerse ourselves in that story. Now, what had just happened in John is Jesus had just spent the evening with his disciples in the upper room, right? They'd talked through what was to come. They'd celebrated a meal of Passover together. And at the end, Jesus prays. And he prays for three things. He begins his prayer and he says, "Father, glorify me. Give me the glory that I once had with you." And then he prays for his disciples. And he says, "Father, let them be connected to you like I am connected to you. Let them tell your story." And then he prays for all the future believers. And he says, "Father, these disciples will tell your story. I pray for the people who hear it, that they'll be connected with you." And after finishing that prayer, John starts chapter 18 like this. When he finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. John's the only one to mention this Kidron Valley. And it can seem like something just to pass over, right? The Kidron Valley, it was necessary to walk through if you were getting from Jerusalem to this Garden of Gethsemane. It runs northeast of Jerusalem. And so you would have had to pass it that night. But there's a reason that John adds this. Because you see, this valley wasn't any other valley. It had a deep, rich, dark history. This is the valley that David was standing in when he was told that his son Absalom was coming after him to kill him. It's that same valley that David looked to his followers and said, "Go to safety while I climb to the Mount of Olives and pray." And in tears, David wept the entire journey. It was this same valley that when Hezekiah cleansed the temple, he took all of what was evil and dark and against God, and he threw it into this valley. And it's the same valley that when Josiah was ruler, he buried all of the common people and the poor. This is a valley of darkness and despair. And as Jesus is walking through this valley on his way to the Garden of Gethsemane, he is feeling the weight of all the death, all the darkness, all the hurt that has come through this valley. And as he gets to this valley, what we learn in the other three Gospels is that Jesus was so much hurting that he turned to Peter, he turned to John, he turned to James, he said, "Follow me up to the Mount of Olives because I'm in agony and I need to pray." And in this prayer, his manner shifts. He prays and he says, "God, if there's any way to take this from me, take it. This cup that you ask me to bear, can you take it? I can't do it anymore. It's just too hard. If there's any way to take the sacrifice that you've asked me to do and give it somewhere else, can you find a ram in a thicket? Can you find somewhere else to do this?" And as Jesus sat there and he's praying and he's agonizing, Luke tells us that he prayed so hard that he began to sweat profusely. And in that moment, God sent an angel, not to answer his prayer, but to encourage him. And as the angel is encouraging Jesus, he looks up and he cries out to God again, "Can you take this cup from me? But if you can't, let your will be done, not mine." See, this is the Jesus that was entering the Garden of Gethsemane that night. Not a Jesus feeling safe and secure. Not a Jesus who was happy and joyful, but one who was beaten, one who was hurting, one who knew what was about to be asked of him. And this is the Jesus that John tells us in verse 2 came face to face with his accusers. He says, "Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met them there. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons." Kind of an interesting description of a group of people to come arrest a guy whose only accusation against him is blasphemy. Only accusation against him is he's called himself God. So we're going to bring what amounts to hundreds of troops with swords and lanterns and torches. Sounds maybe like Judas knew what he was getting into. See, here Jesus moments ago was fervently pleading to God for any other way. He's crying out, "Take this cup from me." And here he is standing and facing his accusers. He doesn't retreat back up the mountain. He doesn't cry out to God in disgust, which, in all honesty, that would have been probably my first choice. Like, God, I prayed, I asked that you take this from me, and now you're making me face it head on. But what's he do? He walks into this moment with a posture of surrender, not out of weakness, not out of despair. He steps out acknowledging that God has answered his prayers, not by taking away, but by providing him strength to proceed. And coming down the mountain into the olive-groved Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus responds to the tension, to the turmoil within him by surrendering. And we see him surrender in three ways. The first we see him surrender is with his identity. See, John tells us that Jesus, knowing that all was going to happen to him, went out and asked them. He said, "Who are you looking for?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," said Jesus, as Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. I am he. Now, this phrase has come up multiple times in the book of John, right? We see Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way and the life. I am the vine." Right? This is this theme that John brings out. Each time Jesus has said this, though, we've seen a counteraction from the people he said it to. Either they argue with him, or they chastise him. In John 10, they tried to arrest him, and Jesus got away. But here we see something a little bit different. Jesus cries out, "I am he," which, right, is the equivalent of "I am God." You want to accuse me of being God? Let me stand right out and tell you that's who I am. And what do these people do? Hundreds of soldiers fall. So I'm a big movie guy. So in my mind, I'm always like, I read stories, I see things like I see movies play out. Right here, The Matrix. Right? Like the dramatic scene in The Matrix where Neo's knocked to the ground and all of a sudden everything pauses for a moment and he stands up and he does this. And he starts to realize, wait, I'm the one. And you've got all these agents shooting at him, and right, the famous scene, his hand goes out and the bullets stop and he grabs one. He just looks at it, drops them. What do the agents do at that moment? Their guns go from here to, like, they just stop and pause. When Christ announced his authority, when he took full reign of himself, when God answered his prayer that his grace be reestablished, everyone took notice. So here's Jesus moments ago fervently pleading for God for any way around his destiny. And here he is standing now, taking his destiny head on. Jesus surrendered completely to who he was. There's not just words are being spoken, it's the authority in which he's saying it. He's creating chaos among the people. There's no second guessing who he is or cloaking it behind his human physique anymore. In this moment, Jesus shows a piece of his glory. The same glory that he had prayed would be restored. And unlike the previous encounters, Jesus doesn't attempt to go away or challenge his accusers any further. This time, he finally came through to fulfill his calling and show the world who he was. And beyond surrendering to his identity, the next thing we see Jesus do is he surrenders in order to save his disciples. Beginning in verse 7, John writes, "And again, Jesus asked them." You guys find that funny? Like, they've already answered the question. Jesus is like, "Hey, while you're on the ground, got another question for you. Who is it that you want? Like, are you really sure you know what you're doing here?" And they reply, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." See, Jesus knew the legal arguments that were associated here. If you were coming after somebody in this time, you had to outline all the people you were coming to arrest. So, the answer to that question, if they were coming to arrest all the disciples, well, I'm here for Jesus of Nazareth, I'm after Peter and Paul and James and John and Bartholomew, and right? He would have named all of them. Jesus knew what he was doing. By asking him and saying, "Hey, who are you after?" He's going, "Hey, the only one you can take here is me. The only one that's done anything wrong here is me." By doing this, he's ensuring that his disciples don't have the same fate that he does. See, in Jesus' prayer in chapter 17, he had prayed for that. He had said, "Father, all that you gave me, I haven't lost any of them except for the one." And he said, "Protect them. Protect them so that they may bring people to you." Now, Peter, like the rest of us, decided he didn't need Jesus' protection. He was going to take things into his own hands. So verse 10, "Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. And Jesus commanded Peter, 'Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup my Father has given me?'" You ever felt like Peter? You're like, "I know God's got this, but I can do this too." There's no way Peter is taking a sword and he's going to defeat hundreds of people. Like, come on, Peter. What are you doing here? But that's what happens when we act out of fear. That's what happens when we act just out of spite and we're like, "I'm just going to do this," right? And let's be honest, this is classic Peter. I mean, how many times has Jesus had to turn to Peter like, "Serious, man, stop it"? Like, literally, have you ever had to look at somebody in your life and say, "Get behind me, Satan"? Like, but this is Peter. This is part of who he is. It's part of the great thing about Peter is that he loves to act and he's just going to do it. But the bad thing about Peter is sometimes he's going to make the wrong choices and he's going to try to save himself when Jesus is already doing it. Sound familiar? See, despite Jesus trying to protect him, Peter's about to change the fate of all the disciples. The swipe of his sword would have labeled them all as aggressors and changed their fate. They would have had the same one as Jesus. No longer would they have had to call out their names, they would have seen their actions. But in Jesus' command, he repeats the words from his earlier prayer, he acknowledging the Father's authority and the true source of Jesus' submission. It also guides Peter to recognize the bigger picture. See, if the disciples were to fight, they'd be cementing their deaths, either on the battlefield or in the court. They would surely end their cause. There would be no need for a rock to build upon. There would become a time for each of these disciples when they're going to be called to make that choice, whether they're going to surrender or fight. And Jesus, in this moment, is teaching them the art of surrender and the power that it has. So with these words, Jesus guides Peter's sword back into place and walks him towards that ultimate surrender. But the last thing Jesus surrenders to is he surrenders to save everyone, to save all the believers. Because John says, "Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people." See, Jesus knew who the disciples would become. They would be teachers and leaders. They would be healers and prophets, and he had prayed earlier for those who would believe through the message of these men. That the whole world would believe in who Jesus was, that they would receive the glory that God had for them by the message of these disciples. There was a bigger picture. He knew he needed to surrender not just to the authorities in front of him, but the death that those authorities had brought. In surrendering himself to arrest, Jesus acknowledged God's answer to his prayer earlier that night. There would be no ram in the thickets. God had provided him with encouragement to proceed because the bigger picture was at stake. Not just his life, but the restoration of a broken world. He surrendered, fulfilled Old Testament prophecies, but unknowingly, in a way that only God can do, his surrender also fulfilled the prophecy of a high priest in Caiaphas. Because Caiaphas, when faced with the fear of what it would be like if the Romans found out that there was somebody with the power like Jesus had, that it would challenge the Romans' authority structure, and they may come and attack Israel and destroy Israel, Caiaphas looked at the rest of the court of priests and he said, it would be better for one man to die than for the rest of us to lose our lives. Better for us to kill Jesus than us to lose Israel. How little did he understand the statements that he was saying. In a way that only God can do, he turned it to him. It is better for one man, for one son of God to die than to lose anyone. Not just Israel, but anyone. See, because here's the big idea. Jesus' surrender leads to our salvation. His surrender led him out of the garden and into a trial, through the streets of Jerusalem and onto a cross. His surrender was the answer because only he was able to take that cup. Only he was worthy of the price. Over the next weeks, as we approach Easter, we're going to see how Jesus' surrender changed the lives of the people in Jerusalem at that time, and how it changes the lives of the people in this room, in this community today. See, Jesus' surrender provides restoration that we crave. That fight that's in us that we can't figure out how to stop, Jesus' surrender is the answer. But we still have to respond. We still have a part to play. And we do this in 3 ways. The first thing we have to do is acknowledge. We have to recognize, hey, we're broken. We got issues. I got issues. I like control. It's a problem. And that day in the fireplace, if I'm being honest, that's really at the heart of it. I didn't feel like I wanted to leave control. I didn't want to hand it over to God, even though it was better. We have to acknowledge that even the best of us is fighting a battle we can't win. We're swinging a sword frantically at a group of hundreds when Jesus is just calling us to put the sword away and surrender with him. But the next thing we have to do is we have to pray. Right? We have to declare to God that we're not enough. We have to declare to God that we recognize that he is. And only he can provide the victory we're looking for. Only he can save us. And in that prayer, we ask him to step in on our behalf. But the last thing we have to do, and for me, it's the hardest, is we have to surrender. See, it's really easy to recognize that we have problems, and it's really easy to pray and ask that those problems go away. But we're also called to surrender those problems, to not keep pulling out the sword and fighting when Jesus is ready to take it for us. And we're called to do this continually. Because if you're like me, always battling something, always walking around with one hand on the sword, you're praying and acknowledging that you're not enough, but then you turn around and try to do it on your own. And as we head into the Lenten season, maybe there's no better time to ask these questions to ourselves. To ask the question, what is it that you're holding on to? And why? Where are you looking for comfort instead of receiving peace? And as we close today, we're going to move to a time of prayer and reflection. I'm just going to leave for each of you to sit as the band plays behind me. Sit in prayer and acknowledgement. What are you holding on to? What does Jesus want you to surrender? And I'll come back up here after a couple minutes and close us out. Father, I hear your voice. Recognize that let this temptation of control, let this fear inside me keep answering for me when you provided the answer I need. Forgive me for trying to do these things on my own. I know your ways are so much better. And I surrender to you. Thank you for sending the Spirit to draw me closer, to provide encouragement. Because if anyone knows, you do, that I need it. I've felt you tugging at me. And today I'm laying down my plans, my desires, myself. I'm walking with open hands and open arms, allowing your surrender to be my answer. Your will be done, Lord, in my life. Father, I just pray over this congregation Father, what a beautiful thing it is to understand that you've put in the work, but how hard it is to live that out. And I pray that you can place that on our hearts today. Pray that you can let us to understand that your surrender is the greatest act. Lord, pray thank you for that. Pray thank you, Jesus, that in your human angst, in your human frustration, in your hurt, your glory shone through your surrender to the Father's will. And I pray, Lord, that we can show your glory to the world in our surrender. I pray these things in your name. Amen.